Comrade Jean, when and why did you join the Trotskyist movement? What was the movement like in the 1930s? What were the conditions of the working class and in the workers' movement as well?
Well, that's a pretty big question. Let me start with the conditions at the time. It was still in the middle of the Depression. Now I know that according to Roosevelt, the Depression was over and he began to have layoffs in the WPA and things. But in fact, in Minnesota especially, the upturn didn't come until much later, till actually war production began. So there was that. There was the Depression, and I had just moved shortly from Upper Michigan, where some of my neighbors were actually poverty struck, and I had felt it at first hand. My girlfriend's best girlfriend's family, we didn't have much, but we were never actually hungry. And this, I saw real poverty there, and the courage of the working class in coping with it, and at the same time the bewilderment. And I'd also seen there some of the effect of Father Coughlin, a fascist, who was using anti-Semitism and all sorts of demagogy to try to organize the working class and to really break up the unions, to turn them away from an independent fight and turn them toward anti-Semitism, anti-black, etc. So I'd been through that, and even in as young as 12 and 13 had begun to argue against some of his arguments. But there was more than that. Hitler had come to power. The story of his anti-Semitism was just beginning to reach home. That affected our whole family. My dad had wanted to take in some German refugees. The Spanish Civil War had begun, and I was beginning to hear things about that. And the threat of a world war was already very apparent, and that bothered me. And this was brought to a head by a couple things. For one thing, one of my teachers in school was a socialist, Norman Thomas type, that is a pacifist socialist, but she nevertheless did explain what socialism was, what it was trying to do, and particularly explained that to a socialist the world was not divided into nations, or shouldn't be, but into two basic classes, the working class and the ruling class, the capitalists. And I still remember very vividly that she put this sketch on the board in which she drew a line across the division by nation and showed us the two classes facing each other. And that had an impact on me. There had also been a teacher's strike, and one of my civics teacher had been a leading organizer of the teachers' union in St. Paul, and this was one of the first lodges in the teachers' union. It was number 18, and the numbers went by that. About the same time, St. Paul was a kind of a backwoods country, but a lot of the people that were friends of my parents in North Dakota, with the effect of the Depression on top of the Dust Bowl out there, had moved to the Twin Cities. And the daughters of two of these friends had become young Communist League members. And they came over several times when I was about 14 to try to recruit me. Or no, I was more than 14. Must have been 50. And but this was in Minneapolis, and I was very fortunate in that, politically fortunate, because the Trotskyists had led a big strike in '34. Now, we hadn't been there, but the aftermath of that strike was apparent in a very lively, very militant trade union movement, and in the fact that Trotskyism was known and had big branches in the Twin Cities, including a very big branch of the Young People's Socialist League. And I also ran into, no, it wasn't there. At some point I ran into a Trotskyist. But I got very interested in the question of socialism, and especially from the point of view of how could a war be prevented. Well, the line of the Stalinists then was that the peace-loving countries had to get together and isolate the warmongers. And it didn't make sense to me. I mean, I didn't see how. I knew a little about imperialism from my history classes. I didn't see how an imperialist country could be a peace-loving country. But in any case, this was the period of the Popular Front drive of the Stalinists, when they were attempting to get all sorts of organizations from the YWCA, YMCA, that is the Christian associations, through Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, any organization they could get their hands on together. And they called a National Youth Congress. Now, first they called a Minnesota Youth Congress. And each of the clubs at the community center where I went elected delegates. And I was a delegate to that. And it was there that I first heard the Trotskyists argue and was impressed. Later, the same Stalinist front called a National Youth Congress in Milwaukee. And the community center, the Jewish Educational Center, sent 5 delegates. And we were interviewed, and I was chosen as one of them. I was the youngest of the delegates. And it was really in there that I heard the Trotskyists from New York, from Hunter College, debate the Stalinists and the pacifists of the Second International, who were preaching isolation. And the Trotskyist position made sense to me. So I went up after the session and told the girls from Hunter that I had agreed with their presentation. And they asked me if I wanted to talk further. I said yes, and they came to my room and we argued, and I was asking questions for hours and hours, till very late at night. And then they asked me to join when I returned home, and I said, well, I'm too young. And they said to me, when are you going to cut the apron string? And that's all it took. And I promised them that when I went home, I would locate the Trotskyists and join.
That was 1937.
That was, the summer of 1937. I don't know, maybe June or early July.
You were not yet 16.
I was not yet 16. When I got home, my dad was waiting up for me to hear how it went. And the first thing I told him was, oh, it was wonderful. And I know what I'm going to do with my life. I'm going to be a revolutionist. I'm going to join the Trotskyist movement. And he said to me, fine, but will you wait till you're 16? And I thought, oh, he thinks I'll forget it. But I thought it was a reasonable request, and I agreed. And in any case, it took me till a little past my 16th birthday before I actually was able to locate the Trotskyists. And I located them also through this Stalinist United Front, because they had called a meeting of the St. Paul Youth Council. When I got the invitation, I went, and there I met a member of the Yipsos. In the meantime, I told these 2 Stalinist girls that I had decided to join the Yipsos, and they said to me, well, that's fine, they're a good organization, but in the Twin Cities, they're Trotskyists. I didn't know what she was talking about exactly, how could this be that? So when I met the Ethel, her name was, this Trotskyist, I asked her what she meant, and she explained to me about the entry into the Socialist Party, and that at that very time the Trotskyist youth were being thrown out. So in fact, I joined the Trotskyist youth, the Young People's Socialist League. At that time it was called the Yipsos 4, instead of the Yipsos 2, which the SP took as their group. And immediately was thrown into party work. Now, already at that point, the Minneapolis movement was much bigger and obviously the leader of the movement. And it had a very large youth section because they had organized the working class youth, the unemployed youth that were around Local 544 into it. The Trotskyists had just as I said, in 34, organized first the truck drivers and broken the open shop in Minneapolis. And this had been not an easy battle, but it had been a historic battle and an important one because it spearhead a national drive that was underway of rebellion against the old craft unions and organization of the mass of the workers, the unskilled factory workers on an industrial basis who hadn't been organized before. And there had been around the same time the Toledo auto light strikes, where a factory that made glass work for the automobiles had gone out on strike. And in California, a longshoreman strike led by a Stalinist named Harry Bridges. The Toledo strike also had been led by socialists, but independent radicals. And the leading man of that strike was a very queer character named Musty, who was also a minister of some sort. But these three strikes together spearheaded and helped coalesce a movement that was underway to organize the union. Now, and the role of our comrades in the 544 strike had a tremendous impact in the whole area, as the crisis did itself. I joined at that point, and as I said, I threw myself wholeheartedly into the work almost immediately. But the thing was, everybody was thinking about these problems, and it wasn't like now when you go to a high school and if you try to talk to high school students about social conditions, a few of them will respond, but in the main they don't know what socialism is, or they connect it with the ex-Stalinist regime. In those days, you couldn't avoid the social issues, and you couldn't address them without confronting the question of socialism. You had to deal with it and either reject it or accept it. But it was, for instance, later after I had told the school started that year, and I told my friends that I was a socialist, I never had a moment's peace. I wasn't being red-baited, but I was constantly barraged by questions. So much so that I had to sort of hide if I wanted any privacy. It was so different that I was given a position as editorial writer for the student paper. I was allowed complete freedom to write what I wanted, even though the advisor of the journalist students herself was quite reactionary. The atmosphere was such that she was forced to let everybody have a free opinion, and I wrote both general editorials and a specific editorial column, and very quickly recruited 4 of my best friends. They didn't all stay naturally. Some stayed months, and at least in one occasion, the comrade stayed 9 years and only left at the time of the Morrow Goldman struggle in 48.
What was the reaction of comrades? I realize you were in the youth at that point, but what was the reaction, as you recall, to the founding? There were great events in the next year, right after you came around the movement, the founding of the Socialist Workers' Party on January 1st, 1938, and in September of that year, the founding of the Fourth International.
Well, the first thing that happened after I joined was that I had to learn about this split and what was causing it, because almost immediately after the expulsion of the party of the older comrades took place, they had been, at the time of the entry, grouped into what was called the Socialist Appeal Group, and they were expelled over the early fall months of 37. So there was, within the youth group, 2 things were going on. First of all, because the 4 of us who had joined more or less with me were considerably younger than the other St. Paul comrades who were more college-age students, there was a lot of education going on. I mean, we held classes and we were given even novels to read, such as him, Tobacco Road, Ignatius Salone's Fontamora and Bread and Wine, a book called I Went to Pitt College, which was a description of the conditions in the coal pits, coal mines. So that was going on at the same time. Within the pages of the Socialist Appeal, which is what the paper was called then, there were articles appearing on the Spanish Civil War and a lot of discussion on that. And I believe it was at that point that Milton Henry Milton, I believe his name was, Harry or Henry Milton, came through on a speaking tour. Now, this was a man who had been a prisoner of the Stalinists in the Spanish Civil War and who had escaped with the aid of the comrades. And that meeting made a tremendous impression on all of us. And we began to discuss more concretely the crimes of Stalinism. So it was, and then of course the trials had taken place, or some of them had, and some were in the middle of taking place. So there was the horror of the terror that was going on within the Soviet Union. Personally, I tried to argue at that point with both my younger brother and my middle brother. My middle brother was quite young, and my folks soon put an end to that. My older brother basically wouldn't talk to his kid sister about politics, first took a very reactionary position, and then developed a crush on the Stalinist who had tried to recruit me, and that was the end of any interest in Trotskyism. But the weekend, New Year's weekend, the SWP was founded. And in the period leading up to that, although we didn't have much discussion about the meaning of the founding or the documents, there certainly was a lot of discussion clarifying us on these international questions, on the trial, on the history of the Russian Revolution, on the crimes of the Civil War. Of course, Milton had spoke of that, but other speakers, Morrow's Civil War in Spain, which came out before Revolution and Counter-Revolution had appeared, and for my junior paper, I had done a paper on the Civil War in Spain, based in large measure on the Morrow book. And in the meantime, at high school, had been arguing with a lot of people. Again, I want to stress how much socialism and the question of how do you get there and do you want to get there, how much in the forefront that was of everybody's thinking. For example, I would of course try to talk to the brightest people in the class, and one of them was the editor of our school paper, and he would never read anything. And he said to me, "It's not that I think you're wrong. I know you're right. And I don't want to read anything because I know I'll join your movement if I read it. I don't want to spend my life doing that." So it was something that people thought about. Of course, there was a lot of belief in Roosevelt and a lot of misunderstanding. I had one argument with a girlfriend in which she was appalled at the idea that the Civil War in Spain was any more than a religious fight. She had been taught it was just a struggle against the Catholic Church, and her job was to support the Catholic Church. And when I tried to discuss fascism with her, she couldn't break with her church, but she just quit talking about the Civil War in Spain, and especially talking to me. So that was the background, and the actual founding of the party wasn't to the youth movement the central thrust that it was to the adult comrades who were doing our training. I remember that Henry Schultz, for instance, was a delegate, and Dorothy was home waiting and told us about it. So we did hear about it. But I don't remember specific things. As spring went on, we began to hear, of course, the fight against the Moscow trials was taking place, and the Dewey Commission was set up. But we began to hear more and more about the struggle to found the Fourth International, and some of the documents came out. My sharpest recollection took place over the discussion of the Labor Party, and it was a lesson that I never forgot. And that was, comrades asked, Dorothy, I think, asked us if anyone wanted to speak for the minority on the Labor Party resolution, that is, those who were opposed to it. And this girl, Ethel, who was the first person I met, spoke up and said she did. And that was that. At that time, later, Dorothy came in. We're a group of, we hung around headquarters a lot. When we weren't doing party work, we were at the party headquarters. Came in to where a group of us, Ethel was also in the party, I should say, were talking, and asked her what she disagreed with, what was her opinion on the Labor Party resolution. And she said, "Oh, I don't disagree. I just knew nobody was going to speak for the minority, and I thought someone should." And really, Dorothy tore into her that we weren't a debating society, that when we took a position, it was our position. We weren't trying to score points on the whole question of what a political discussion meant, and really ripped her apart. No, this wasn't a very good member anyway. But the lesson of that, of what an internal discussion was in the party and how seriously one had to take their own expression of themselves, that part of it lived with me in some sense even sharper than the actual content of the fight for a Labor Party, which took place much more within the party branch. Now, we didn't go to party branch meetings. There was a much sharper division between the youth and the party than there was in the early days of the Workers' League with the founding of the Young Socialists. And in fact, I began to ask to join the Socialist Workers' Party and was just told I was too young and I would lose interest in the youth movement if I joined. So that I wasn't part of the internal discussions that took place. I do remember the jubilation after the founding of the party, and of course we did discuss the transitional program. And I remember very well that the discussion ran along the lines as these were demands that would take the working class where they are, and that had to be fought for to solve the problems of the working class, but that could not be achieved without the socialist revolution. The technicality of why capitalism couldn't really afford a sliding scale of wages and hours, for instance, was the occasion for some lessons in Marxist economics, and was thoroughly discussed, not in the sense of supporting it against an opposition, but in the sense of training us as Marxists. And the other items in the transitional program were part of that. Another thing that was discussed in that period was Trotsky's letter to the youth suggesting the change of name. And those discussions were very valuable to me because he was really discussing the nature of the youth movement, of what is a revolutionary youth movement, and why Young People's Socialist League as a name didn't really convey a fighting organization, what the youth movement had to be. It was at that time that the banner on the Challenge of Youth became a red banner, and our paper, the youth paper Challenge of Youth, became much more lively. Thomas might be interested to know that we sold the Challenge of Youth at a first-run, first-class theater the night of the opening of From Czar to Lenin, and that was in '37 when I was still in high school. We also, in that period, there were, of course, a lot of strikes. There was a strike of the WPA workers. No, it was a cavalcade on the state capitol of the WPA workers protesting the strike, the cuts in them. And I rode in that in one of the cars with the other youth comrades and the comrades from the Federal Workers section of 544. So although we never knew the trade unionists intimately, with the exception of Schultz, who lived in St. Paul, we did, run into them and get a chance to see them. And that was more or less how that remained. The only real struggle prior to the 38 founding of the convention was on the question of the Labor Party. It was the only part of the transitional programs that, to my knowledge at least, arose out of which an opposition arose, is what I'm trying to say. The whole discussion, the whole summer, increased my political knowledge tremendously, and to a certain extent, all four of us. One of the girls dropped out very early because her sister got leukemia, and she got very family-oriented. The others, leukemia.
Yeah.
And of course, those days there was no cure for any cancer.
So then you actually joined the party?
Later.
In the fall or the winter then?
Then after, was it early in 39 that the Shachtman fight began?
No, that wasn't too, well, okay, there were signs of it, but it
right.
wasn't, yeah.
There were, in August of 39, the Stalinists signed the Stalin-Hitler pact. That is a pact with Hitler, in which Stalin declared that the friendship between the German people and the Soviet people was sealed in blood. Of course, history revealed where the blood was coming from, and the permanence of that pact. At the time, it took us all, or most of us at least, very much by surprise, although there had been speeches about the possibility that the coming World War would not be between Hitler on the one hand and the Allies on the other, but would be between Stalin and Hitler on the one side and imperialists on the other. Nobody had taken it very seriously till that pact had been signed. Simultaneously with the signing of the pact, an immense crisis broke out both within the CP and among the periphery of the CP, and of course within the periphery and among a section of the SWP. But before I knew that, I was at home. I still lived at home in those days, and my brother had already become a Stalinist, and I remember a fight between my dad and him, at which he insisted there would be no war as a result of this fight, and said that if Poland was invaded, he would enlist. He would leave the CP and enlist in the U.S. Army. He was traveling on the road at that time with one of these. I'm working my way through college selling magazines, one of those crews, because there were, as I said, there were literally not jobs for unskilled youth. And in fact, with the invasion of Poland, he did join the army, and he was at Pearl Harbor when the bombs fell several years later. Within the party, there began to be rumblings about, don't we have to re-examine the question of the defense of the Soviet Union under these terms? And that was a foreshadowing, or maybe the fight was already going on, but we didn't know it in the Ipsos at the beginning. But by the fall of that year, those comrades who were most serious within the youth movement were invited to join the party. And I was one in St. Paul. At the same time and at the same meeting, Bill joined from Minneapolis, and although I knew him then, I wasn't aware he was at that meeting. It was many years later that we discovered we had joined on the same night. And with that, we were thrown into the center of the fight. And my first reaction was, how can these people be so stupid? They put up with the Moscow trial. They put up with the murder of Lenin's Central Committee, and they want to split the party and declare we can't defend the Soviet Union on the basis of a signing of a pact. I was horrified about the signing of the pact, too, but I agreed with the explanation that the class nature of the Soviet Union was not based on the actions or the line of the CP. It was based on the fact that the revolutionary gains of October had not been overthrown yet, and that although the gains made by the working class and in fact Soviet power had been destroyed, the historic establishment of socialized property, of the monopoly of foreign trade, still remained, and that it would more or less take a revolution and certainly a social upheaval for a counter-revolution to succeed. I also accepted the argument that to declare the Soviet Union some kind of a new form of class society would be to assign to the bureaucracy a progressive role. But even before my intellectual agreement was an emotional agreement, just a kind of a shock that all of these people who wrote so well for the party and who had attacked the Moscow trial so brilliantly, wrote about the terror in Spain, could over the signing of this pact be ready to change the party line. I should make clear that I was in the St. Paul branch, and at that stage of the transportation system, there were two different cities, very definitely. It took over an hour to drive from one city to another, and if we took the streetcar, which ran in those days, it was more than an hour and a half and quite expensive. So we didn't meet often as one unit. We mostly met separately. The other thing I should have stressed, and I want to stress, is how it was a period of very immense historical developments, and in the main because of Trotsky's articles, which appeared in Socialist Appeal and occasionally in an internal bulletin, although usually in the Socialist Appeal. We had such a strong feeling of participating in big historic events. He made the comrades, or at least this was my reaction, and I think it was general, very aware of our role in history, and that what we did today was part of making history, and also that how we fought the Stalinists was an important historical task. And we weren't aware of Stalinism. We didn't conceive of it as an outside enemy, as something outside of ourselves. It was a present reality oppressing the working class, and one in which we were involved in a life and death battle. I also made one small error. I spoke of having argued politics with my younger brother. I met my older, at that time my youngest brother was 10. I don't think I bothered talking politics to him too much.
Okay, so you want to go on from here? You were beginning to describe the circumstances under which you actually joined the party. In other words, the Shachtman-Burnham
fight. Well, I had the essence of the Shachtman-Burnham fight, of the position taken by Shachtman and Burnham, was that because of the Stalin-Hitler pact and the crimes of Stalinism in that regard, that we could no longer defend the Soviet Union nor consider it a socialist state.
A worker state.
A worker state. The documents that came out flew thick and fast. We could barely keep up with them. And particularly Shachtman was always very, very long-winded. But Trotsky moved the discussion. He was very much a part of the fight. It wasn't like it was the American section fighting within itself. It became an international struggle at which Trotsky was leading the fight for Marxism. And he very early on wrote the document, which is one of the key documents in the Trotskyist movement, Petty Bourgeois Opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party. And in it is a section called the ABC of Marxism, of dialectics, his introduction to dialectical materialism. And this created immense interest, even apart from the internal fight, in and of itself. I was going to the university that year. I went 1 year out of high school and was in the U when that document came out, and did my paper for my philosophy course on dialectical materialism, attempting to learn as much as I could. Interestingly, I recently found the paper, and it isn't so bad considering that it was written by a youngster new to politics and very much an amateur, but it was nothing I would be ashamed if people saw either. But this interest was fairly widespread. But also within the youth movement, there was immense skepticism. And of course, historically, you may know that virtually the entire leadership of the youth movement went with the Shachtman-Burnham minority at the time of the split. And locally, although we had no minority as such in the Twin Cities, nobody who defended the minority position, we lost almost all of the college-age Yipsels. Bill was at the university, but he was a young college student. The older ones all left. There were a whole section of them going to school at the University of Chicago who became Thomasites. That's some variety of Catholicism. And they were converted to that during that period. Thomasites. Thomas, all right. They had a different word for it. Interestingly, just before the war started, these same group of young radicals were going to buy a desert island out in the Pacific and go live on it to escape the coming World War. Party. I think that the youth that were asked to join the Socialist Workers' Party were party. I think that the youth that were asked to join the Socialist Workers' Party were outside of this group of intellectual college students who had expressed all sorts of...
Periphery.
Yeah. Well, they weren't really the periphery. They were in the youth movement. But, for instance, the one I remember, one of them was the daughter of a doctor. One was the son of the literary critic for the local paper. They were that type. They weren't of the working class at all. Mm-hmm. And they were very impressed, not impressed, but influenced by the right-wing turn among the whole layer of intellectuals that began even before the Stalin-Hitler pact, but reached a certain climax at that point, so that they were ready for the attack of Shachtman and Burnham and sort of looking for excuses by that point. You have to understand that the period was completely different. I said that in relation to our having turned towards socialism. But even among the intellectuals, I mean, there were people living like Dewey. You could pick up a book at a library and read it without getting sick. You know what I mean? There were good intellectuals around that you could learn from. Even Fortune magazine, which was written for the ruling class, would have real studies, as they did on the Spanish Civil War, from which we could learn. And many of the intellectuals had been swept up in the enthusiasm for the Russian Revolution, and a good number of those became supporters of the Trotskyists. Some of us were speaking before about people like Max Eastman, who translated much of Trotsky's work, was never a member of the party, but was a strong
He was a fellow traveler.
A fellow traveler who felt extremely close to Trotsky. And with the right-wing turn, completely turned away. Sidney Hook was never quite that close, but nevertheless, he was in that group. Among the writers, there were people like James T. Farrell and for a time John Dos Passos, who considered themselves very close to the Trotskyist movement, and many of them, in fact, had played a role in the defense of Leon Trotsky, either directly on the committee.
Are you sure about this process? I'm very, very skeptical about that.
But I was going to say in helping to raise money. Yes, they were. For instance, Dewey Albinson, a painter, a local painter, donated a picture. People who were musicians were giving, I can't think of their names now, but there were concerts given. And this wasn't only locally, it was nationally. They played the role of helping us to raise money then, and in fact, some of them continued that role for a few more years. But the actual impact on the membership spread beyond those who took a position in support of Shachtman. There were many middle-class layers who just became inactive or who became skeptical and then left the party later, after the war, with the Burnham Morrow Group. Goldman Morrow Group, sorry. It's a lucky thing we have someone who can talk here. But what I was trying to say wasn't just that this layer of intellectuals who were close to the party changed. The whole intellectual atmosphere in the country, to a certain extent, changed. Got swept up in anti-war, in pro-war sentiment, in support for Roosevelt, and of course, both the Stalinist bureaucracy and the trade union bureaucracy played a real role in this, and there were big campaigns on the part of both to organize the working class behind Roosevelt. And this campaign was not separated, but was at the heart, really, of the attacks that began to come on the party after the Burnham-Shachtman fight, and particularly between that time and the declaration of war. More and more, Trotsky expected an attack on his life, and the party made attempts to deal with that, to set up security. And in fact, Henry Schultz, whom I referred to before, he was a skilled worker, a skilled electrician, and handy at almost everything in the building trades, had been recruited during the 544 strike and played a leading role almost from the beginning of joining the party, was at the founding convention of the SWP. He was sent to Koyukon to beef up the defense, and in fact had only come home about 10 days before the assassination of Leon Trotsky. And I don't even know how to report the impact of that. It was certainly as if your dearest relative and mentor combined had been shot and waiting for the noose. Waiting for the news after we heard the first notice of his, that he had been pickaxed, rather. And waiting for the effect of the operation, and then getting the phone call that he had died before the doctor had even arrived, was like sitting at a wake. In fact, that's what we did in the St. Paul branch. We all went to Dorothy and Henry's home, and we were sitting around waiting from minute to minute for messages from New York telling us what was going on. And it was an enormous blow to the party, but it was not a blow that in any sense destroyed the fight. I think it's important because later you hear all sorts of things about how the party never had a leadership after Trotsky's death, etc. But the immediate effect was nothing like that. The sense of loss was very great, but there was no political disorientation. There was no feeling that we were, at least that I can recall, any feeling that we now were headless, so to speak, that we couldn't go forward. Instead, there was a great determination not to allow this to sidetrack the main fight, but to expose the role of Stalinism. There was never any doubt in any of our minds that the Stalinists were behind this, even long before we could prove any connection. In fact, it was many, many years before the connections were all proven. But there was no doubt in our mind that they were there. One thing that isn't as well known is that we tried to bring his body to New York for burial, and were not allowed to. Even dead, they were afraid of Trotsky and his ideas, and we could not bring it in. That was August of 1940. Very shortly after that, of course, during this time, Roosevelt had already began his drive toward war and had stepped up the propaganda and the attacks on the living standards of the workers and his preparation to have a controlled working class during the war. And I don't remember exactly when he got the pledge of no strikes during the war. He got a pledge that the wage freeze would be accepted. Rationing was put into effect. But these things actually went into effect before the declaration of war. The party led a campaign against the wage freeze, which got a lot of support in the ranks, and even promises from some of the leaders to ignore it. But in practice, the trade union leadership buckled under immediately. And this was not, it was really the beginning of the betrayal of the bureaucracy and the beginning of the point where the new leadership, the leadership that had risen and helped create the CIO, where they became agents of the ruling class in a direct sense. I should explain a little, I think it helps make it clear that there were actually two kinds of leadership in the CIO at that time. There were the old line leaders. For instance, Phil Murray of the steelworkers had been appointed by Lewis in the first place, was never thrown up by the struggle, and any more than John L. Lewis himself, more or less took advantage of the movement of the working class rather than led it. On the other hand, there were, and especially in such unions as auto and packing, there was a leadership created that took the fight. But that leadership was rapidly, very rapidly, and by this time, by 1940, became an instrument for the ruling class, in part from the very nature of the trade union as an instrument which bargains for the conditions under which workers saw its labor power under capitalism. It is a limitation Marxists recognize in the trade union movement. But because of the war condition, because of the degeneration of the destruction, really, of the Communist Party as an organ of the working class, and its conversion to a tool of Soviet diplomacy and put at the service of Soviet diplomacy, combined with the role that they also did play in the rise of the union movement, it created extra pressure on the bureaucracy to support Roosevelt and to support the war drive. And a very reactionary attack was made on the union movement. Now, the center of that attack was on our movement, because the center of the fight against the betrayal of the working class was coming under the leadership of 544. This leadership by now had immense prestige across much of the Midwest, not just in the Twin Cities. They had organized the first over-the-road truck drivers contract. They had helped many of the locals in the Midwest get started as industrial locals, and there were supporters of the Trotskyist movement as a result, and members in many cities where there had been no membership before, such as Omaha, St. Louis, places that are less well known nationally and internationally, but played an important role. Same thing was happening in packing. And Roosevelt had to stop this. He had, and at once, and he enlisted for this Tobin. Now, Tobin was an old line bureaucrat who had opposed the comrades in the Teamsters. At one time had tried to throw them out of the Union, but had really been defeated both by the way in which the party mobilized the actual support of the Minneapolis and area-wide working class, so that they could not, at that point in the struggle, throw the Trotskyists out. But now, with the beginning of the war drive, they felt they had another chance. And they issued a statement that any leadership which would not go along with the no-strike pledge and the support of the war, and of course I don't remember offhand the exact wording, but that was the meaning of it, would be disciplined. And and began to move toward taking over 544. At that point, the comrades talked to a section of the CIO, a sort of catch-all section, and made arrangements to transfer the Union into the CIO with John L. Lewis and his brother who ran this catch-all section, and with the knowledge of the membership. It was voted on by a membership. They voted to transfer the treasury. The first attack that came down that indicated what was ahead was that the comrade who was treasurer of 544, a man by the name of Kelly Postal, was arrested for embezzling funds and tried and eventually sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, even though there was never any real question that he had taken this money for his own benefit or anything. That didn't even come up. And it was not long after that, in fact, I think it was before his actual trial, when the raids on the St. Paul and Minneapolis headquarters took place. The FBI came down almost simultaneously in both places and literally took everything they could out of the headquarters. Most of what they got was public material published to be circulated. Copies of the Communist Manifesto, copies of the Declaration of Principles, but they also got some letters and some leaflets and material that was less well known. And the first reaction of the comrades, and really even of the militant, if you go back and read it, was that this was an attack on the Union movement and on the 544. And the evidence for that made us think that was the fact that most of the comrades who were indicted when the indictments came down were not known nationally as party figures, but as trade unionists. There were, I think, 4 from New York, a few local political people like Dorothy Schultz, Grace Carlson, and Ray was a union figure. I don't remember. There were a few who were strictly political. But in the main, the people arrested were from the union leadership, or some of them not even leaders. Some we didn't even know till the trial began. Not many, but a few. But very soon, we made the connection that this was part of the drive to organize the working class toward war and to suppress any opposition to the war. And at first, the government was very blatant about it and would say that in their propaganda. Later, they tried to say it was because of our actual attempt to overthrow the government by force and violence. Maybe I should go a little into the indictments themselves, because we were indicted on 2 charges. One was a Civil War Act making it illegal to, I want to get this right, I hope I don't mix the two, to conspire to overthrow the government. The other was a more recent law passed shortly before the war effort began, called the Smith Act, which made it illegal to advocate the overthrow of the government. Their evidence that we were organizing the overthrow, conspiring to overthrow the government, was the existence of the Union Defense Guards. And these were guards set up when the fascists, particularly the Silver Shirts were the name of the group involved, had attempted to set up an organization in Minnesota, publicly and openly directed at smashing 544. And the comrades had organized defense guards to protect the meetings and to protect the Union Hall and things like that. At the time of the indictment, this guard existed for the purpose of throwing a Christmas party and appearing as, as safety guards at the Union picnic and little else. And nevertheless, that was one big charge. The trial and the preparation for the trial, the way it was conducted, really consolidated the party in its own defense. First of all, we mobilized a lot of support. We're constantly going to unions and had unions representing literally millions of workers who came out against the trial. The Stalinists, of course, did everything possible to prevent the union movement from endorsing us. In Minnesota, they controlled the CIO paper, and they also controlled one of the important Democratic Farmer Labor, oh, it wasn't Democratic Farmer Labor, I beg your pardon, Farmer Labor Party papers. And in there they had such headlines as, support the government attack against the fascists. And the only criticism they made of the government is that we should be tried not as socialists, but as fascists and union gangsters. And that was, of course, it created some difficulty, but it created much more for them because there was an immense amount of prestige for these people. Grace Carlson, who was one of the defendants named and was ultimately the only woman defendant to go to prison, quit her job. She worked for the state rehabilitation department as a psychologist to work full-time for the party at this time and to run for Senate. It was one of our first campaigns, and we ran on a strictly anti-war position. Before the trial began, the headquarters was organized to welcome and feed and take care of all of the defendants and all of the family. And the raids took place in July, I believe. The indictments came down not shortly after, I think before the end of August. The trial began October or November. It must have begun in October and lasted about 8 weeks. The family, as I said, met at headquarters for meals, and the defendants would march to the courthouse for every session in the morning, march back at noon, and back to the courthouse and back at noon. Babysitting was arranged so that the wives of as many defendants as possible could attend the trial, and as many comrades as possible did. I should explain that our headquarters at that time was on one of the main downtown streets, and it was a straight shot down to the courthouse, marching down this street. So you had the comrades led by James Buchanan and V.R. Dunn marching proudly down the street to this trial, not at all acting like criminals who had something to be ashamed of, but really proud of the banner which they stood for. And in fact, the whole defense was conducted that way. There was no cringing, no apology. For various personal reasons, I wasn't able to attend every session, although I got to some of them. But Bill tells the story that he attended every session except one that he got thrown out of because they had all sorts of stooges, some bought off and some just stupid, who said that they had heard us declare we were for the overthrow of the government by force and violence, and a few of them spoke about our having guns hidden. And one gal got up and said that she had been told that we had guns in the floors of the churches waiting to be dug up. And Bill cracked up. He started laughing. They threw him out, wouldn't let him back in that day. But the point is, some of these comrades had a weird sense of humor, and all of us could hear Mick Dunn or Harry DeVore telling some stupid secretary that, and her taking it literally. So it was, anyway, they did a poor show, and the comrades spoke brilliantly against it. And as you may know, two permanent works of literature, both of immense value, came out. One was Cannon's testimony, both under direct and cross-examination, printed at that time for 10 cents under the title In Defense of Socialism. And, no, Socialism on Trial. And that pamphlet sold out many editions, many, and was reprinted many times in the early, in the mid to late 40s. The other pamphlet was Albert Goldman, who was a leading comrade from Chicago, a lawyer, who was both one of the defendants and the head of the defense team. And his final speech to the jury, which lasted 2 days, was printed under the title In Defense of Socialism. And that pamphlet today, I don't know if it is all over the country, but at the University of Minnesota, it is in the law library as in the section reserved for law theory, and is one of the best sources of knowledge about conspiracy theory and the difference between the two charges, between conspiring to overthrow the government by force and violence and conspiring to advocate the overthrow. Now, the second one, of course, is in direct conflict with the First Amendment guaranteeing the right of free speech and free assembly, because advocating is a speech question. And one of the defenses was that this was unconstitutional. The timing of the trial was such that the trial ended, the jury verdict came in, and the verdict found the comrades all non-guilty on the charge of conspiring to overthrow the government, but guilty on the second charge of conspiring to advocate. Not all of them, 18. 5 had been dismissed before any defense was presented. 5 more had been were dismissed at the end of, by the jury, I believe it was.
Or acquitted, you mean, by the jury?
Acquitted by the jury, as there being no evidence against them directly. The judge brought in his report on a Friday. The jury brought in their report on a Friday. The judge said he'd do the sentencing on Monday, and on Sunday the bomb was dropped on Pearl Harbor. And we were gathered in the headquarters, and most of us heard the news about the bomb being dropped on our way to headquarters, where we were going to have a meeting on the summation of the trial and the victory that was represented by the jury verdict, because it was seen as a real victory. The only thing we had been found guilty of was the charge, which was unconstitutional. And in addition to that, the jury recommended leniency, which showed that the defense really hadn't had quite an impact on the jury. But at the same time, the bombing worried us, because we thought the judge would be really vindictive and throw the book at us. In fact, the sentences were, considering the seriousness of the charge, fairly light. Forget how it is, but some of them got a 11-month sentence, and the rest got an 18-month sentence. It was just enough so that in all cases they lost their civil rights. The party, of course, immediately launched an appeal on the unconstitutionality of the law. Again, the Stalinists throughout the whole appeal process played the role of attempting to do everything they could to prevent the buildup of support for the party. and the trade union bureaucracy in its main, certainly the top bureaucracy, did the same thing. But again, a lot of the local unions, or even some of the smaller internationals, did come out in support of the party. The Supreme Court, on the other hand, refused to hear the case. In other words, they did not uphold the constitutionality of the law. They simply refused to hear it, and if I remember, not once but 2 or 3 times. Many years later, during the McCarthy period, the law was overthrown as unconstitutional, but not until after it had been used against slews of people, Communist Party members, Hollywood figures, etc. The last time we spoke together, I was talking about the 3 major attacks the party faced between 39 and about 42, just prior to and at the beginning of the war, and I think I want to sum that up a little. First of all, there was the attack from within the party by the Burnham-Shachtman petty bourgeois opposition, which actually, on the surface of it, damaged the party. It split it, and the loss of membership, and for a long time the turn inward appeared to hurt the work. Then, of course, there was the biggest crime of the century, the murder of Trotsky, and that had an enormous impact on the International and on the work at Socialist Workers' Party, on all of us personally, and on the party as a instrument. But the predictions that it would destroy the party were something else again. It just didn't happen. And then there was the trial, the government attack, and the direct attack on the rights of the party, which eventually included, in the early stages of the war, the loss of our second-class mailing rights for the militant. By that time, the name had been changed back to the militant. And yet, of course, the loss of Comrade Trotsky was a terrible blow, and it's hard to know if the future development and the future internal battles, the new revisionism that arose both in after the end of the war and in '53, if those would have turned out different had Trotsky been able to take part in them. But the destruction of the Trotskyist movement that was predicted by our enemies certainly did not take place. And ultimately, a new leadership was built, which functioned and now exists in the ICFI. The other 2 attacks on the party actually strengthened the party. The blow of the petty bourgeoisie, although we left a large section of intellectuals and a large section of the college-age youth, the middle-class elements. In actuality, we emerged much stronger from the fight because the political understanding and the understanding of the method of Marxism, dialectical materialism, both strengthened the cadre, and we emerged a much more homogeneous, much more educated Marxist. Those comrades won in the entry period during the time the Trotskyists were in the Second International, received a firm foundation, as in the youth which joined the Socialist Workers' Party, and became very valuable cadre for some years. The prison term did not devastate, and the loss of the role of the comrades during the prison also was not the devastating blow that even we thought it would be. The secondary leadership was chosen carefully. Morris Stein, known to us as Moishe, played a marvelous role as temporary national secretary of the party, and not only held the party together, but gave it leadership during the 18 months that Buchanan and the other major leaders were in prison, which was the first period of the war. So that the blows the party suffered did not in any sense break the continuity of Marxism, but prepared us for the next stage ahead.